just so everyone is aware, we are recording this session. There we go. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Anna Weber, who is joining us from the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C., USA. She has joined us. My introduction to Anna came actually just through the Twitters, and then I cold called her to see if she's willing to talk with me for the Geographies of Risk podcast, which she did, and we had a really good episode on. We talked about a lot of things, but a lot of it had to do with sort of flood disaster in the U.S. and the National Flood Insurance Program, and then matters arising. So I know as a policy analyst and with a very deep knowledge of sort of flood disaster response in the U.S. and the policy side of those events and the very complicated sort of governance structure that sort of puts into motion. So it's wonderful that you're joining us today, and thank you very much for being here. And we're ready when you are.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Does that look like a presentation to you?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. You see the slides in full screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm never quite sure which of the screens it's going towards. All right. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk to you all. As Eli mentioned in our podcast episode, we talked a bunch about flooding and disasters in general, and sort of centered around this idea of the myth of the natural disaster. Today I just want to expand on that a little bit and provide some specific examples, how that relates to the work that we do here at NRDC. If I'm a little distracted, it's because I was up all night with this sad, elderly, sick boxer that I'm fostering for a local dog shelter. Poor guy. So if there's suddenly noise off screen, it's because something is happening with the dog, but hopefully he'll let us get through this hour unscathed. All right, anyway, if you're listening to this, I'm sure that you agree that climate change is making disasters worse. Usually we talk about disasters in terms of how much money they cost, because that's basically the easiest, not that it's easy, but it's the easiest way to figure out the magnitude of an event. It's a lot easier than figuring out the true human impact in any case. And besides, it lets us make yearly diagrams like this one, where we can make little cartoon houses that are very surprised about hailstorms. And that little surprise looking house is actually a good way to represent sort of our traditional way of thinking about disasters. If you Google disasters or natural disasters, you get a lot of hits like this, and you can sort of imagine the movie preview guy with the deep voice saying, like, in a world where natural events remind us we are small and vulnerable, right? That's sort of our cultural our sort of cultural understanding of what a disaster is. It's something that's big and external, and you can't do anything but sort of prepare the best you can and hunker down. And that's certainly how we teach our children about disasters. This is a book that I enjoyed a lot when I was about 5 years old. You can read it with your children. In this book, there's a kid who goes out in his fields with his dad one day, and a volcano springs up out of the ground with no warning, and it's a disaster. And I mean, that did happen once in 1943, and that's what this book is about. But that way of looking at disasters is not only inaccurate, it's also dangerous. And not just because it leads to headlines like these, which, what does this even mean? Is this supposed to be news? I don't know. taking a step back, when we think about risk, we often think about it as the intersection of exposure to a particular hazard and then your vulnerability to that hazard. And the same thing is true for disasters. So if we're thinking about that headline that seemed so surprised that major metropolitan areas are at risk of disaster, well, absolutely. Major metropolitan areas often are located in an area with hazards. I mean, everywhere has hazards, but if you think of major coastal cities, they're subject to coastal storms, or cities happen to be on rivers a lot of the time. They're near rivers and flooding can take place there. There's exposure to these hazards because we've put things there that are of value, our buildings, our infrastructure, our lives, our homes. And we all have vulnerability to these hazards. And so in an area where there's a lot of people and a lot of expensive things, in the face of a hazard, of course, we're going to have disasters there. And of course, when we think about it in terms of money, that's where we're going to have the most exposure to financial risk. And so when each of these components, the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability are high, and they sort of coincide together, that intersection is that's also a disaster, right? When all of those things are large and occurring at the same time. So because of that, very few aspects of risk are natural in the sense that they come from the earth and we can't control them. And thinking like that lets humans off the hook. None of those three circles in the diagram apply equally to all people. And they do that because of the way that we've constructed our institutions and the way that we respond to events. Some people experience hazards more frequently because of where they live. Some are more exposed because of how they live, the sorts of housing and neighborhoods where they live. Some people have greater vulnerability because of any number of characteristics: age, disability status, race, gender, and so on. And of course, a lot of the bad outcomes from disasters are actually associated with the way that we as a society respond to disasters, and not the actual event themselves. And so this is something that scholars have been thinking about for a long time, that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. And thinking about it that way is not productive in sort of moving towards a better future where people are less affected by natural hazards. In this particular article, this is the one that was sort of in the middle of the previous screen, is by Yesenia Funes, and you can go look it up online. I really recommend it. But she really brings home this idea that the different ways that people experience hazards and risk are not accidents. They're put into place by human decisions. And on the one hand, that's horrifying because it means that we as a society are putting our fellow human beings at risk. But it also means that we have the ability to take action to change that, which is at least, something that we can do. So this brings us to my work here at NRDC. I really like this headline, except for the part where it says natural disasters. We'll just ignore that because it brings us to flood insurance. This is one of the sort of key policy targets of our advocacy here on my team at NRDC. On the face of it, advocacy around the National Flood Insurance Program may seem a little bit odd for an environmental organization, but for better or worse, this is one of the most important and central climate adaptation policy areas in the U.S. federal government. It has a huge potential to contribute to more equitable climate adaptation strategies, or at least a climate adaptation strategy in general. But right now it is fulfilling the opposite role and making everything worse. So just a little bit of background. You may be aware that the US is not exactly like awash in public insurance, but we do have flood insurance. And the reason we have that is in the mid-20th century, flood losses, financial losses were increasing, and private insurers didn't want to be on the hook for those costs. It's a very difficult pool of risk to insure, and private insurers figured that they couldn't make money on that, and the way they can with, say, healthcare. And so the federal government decided to step in and create a public flood insurance program. And because of this, the NFIP had a few different roles from the very beginning, not just selling insurance, but also mapping flood risk so we can decide how to sell insurance, basically how to price it for different buildings in different areas, set minimum codes and standards for local jurisdictions that want to have their residents buy this flood insurance. Essentially, the federal government says, okay, anyone in your town can have flood insurance through the flood insurance policy. We commit to trying to keep it affordable, but we want you, the local government, to try and drive down that risk. And so what we're going to do is force you to adopt some sort of minimum building and zoning codes so that we know you're not just building willy-nilly in the floodplain. We'll come back to that later. And the other thing that they do is they provide some assistance in order to take action to reduce risk. And so the flood insurance dedicated pools of money that go towards grants for things like elevating homes or financing home buyouts. And so this is sort of how it's supposed to work. The flood insurance program is supposed to continue selling flood insurance. And the idea is that meanwhile, everything else, all of these other roles would work together to drive down the risk. And so we would barely even need flood insurance anymore. That's what they thought in the 60s and 70s. Of course, that is absolutely not how it worked. None of this really worked out as planned. And I want to just talk quickly about one very key example that illustrates this, I think, really well. So one of the concepts that we talk about a lot here at NRDC in the context of flood insurance is the idea of a severe repetitive loss property, or SRLP. It's a terrible acronym, but hence, you know, and anything when you work with FEMA is sort of drowning in horrible acronyms. So these are homes that have sustained several losses that were insured by the flood insurance program. It's just like the name suggests. They're either severely flooded a couple of times or repetitively flooded multiple times. And so these aren't homes that are just hit by a tropical storm one time and they get a flood insurance payout and sort of go on, the residents go on with their lives. This is severe and sustained flooding. And there's about 37,000 of these properties in the US. The graph shows only 35,000 because not all of them have dates associated with them, so I can't show them in the chart. But this is a sort of cumulative accounting over time of the number of these properties that are on the books for the National Flood Insurance Program. So not surprisingly, you can see some big events, big flood events, mostly tropical storms, that increase the number of these severe repetitive loss properties in a particular year. Hurricane Katrina, obviously, there was a lot of flooding across the US in 2011, and then Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and finally in 2017, obviously huge amounts of flood damage with Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. But keep in mind that for each of the properties that is added to this list because of, say, Katrina, doesn't mean they just flooded in Katrina. It means that they probably flooded 3 times before Katrina. And Katrina is just the event that adds them to the list where they qualify for this severe repetitive loss status. So this is a really interesting sort of tip of the iceberg of chronically flooded properties. And we can see a lot of interesting things about the flood insurance program looking at the characteristics of this data set. So this is bad enough, right, that there's 37,000 of these severe repetitive loss properties, but let's take a little bit of a closer look. And before we do that, I want to remind you that, of course, these aren't just properties. This is an insurance program, so we talk a lot about buildings and assets and finances, but I just want to remind all of us, you know, that the poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote that the universe is not made of atoms, it's made of stories, and that's so true of this work. There are so many stories, thousands and thousands of them out there, just like this one. You can learn a little bit more about our friend of NRDC, Olga McKissick, on our website if you like. But she's just one of these thousands of people who are living with flooding year after year after year. All right, so taking a closer look at the severe repetitive loss properties, we know that some of them have been what we call mitigated. Now, of course, in the climate adaptation space, when we talk about mitigation, we talk about decreasing risk. We're not talking about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know why they use the same word. It confuses us all. But the light gray properties here on this graph have been, they've had some action taken to decrease their risk. Most of them, it's because they've had an elevation done. So someone physically went in and lifted the house up on pilings or stilts, or just raised the foundation so that it is now above the height of what we expect a flood to be. A number of them, quite a few in fact, have received buyouts. This is another area where we do a lot of work at NRDC. The idea with a buyout is you, as a public entity, provide money to buy a person's house, and then instead of redeveloping the land, you let them move elsewhere and then tear down what's on the property and sort of preserve it as open space to reduce not just the risk to that family, but also to the surrounding neighborhood, because now you have open space that can absorb floodwaters and so on and so forth. Again, just like anything with flood insurance, it's not that simple and it doesn't always go as planned. And there's a lot of issues with these buyouts. But it is, on paper, at least a very effective way to reduce risk. So if we look at this, this seems okay. This is pretty good. This is maybe what, a third of these properties have been mitigated over time. Years with big flood events tend to have big chunks of properties that have been mitigated because that's when the money flows, right, after a big disaster. But also we can look at this other section of properties, and these are properties that have not been mitigated, but they are also reported as being no longer insured under the flood insurance program. So these are properties that were covered by the NFIP at some point, but they're not anymore. We don't know why. We don't know what happened. I assume it's because flood insurance got too expensive for whoever was paying the policy. But as far as we know, since they are not reported as being mitigated, these homes are still at risk, and the residents don't even have insurance to help them recover from these floods that, as far as we know, they're continuing to experience. So if you look at the breakdown of these three categories of severe repetitive loss properties, is not good. About 40% of them are current or active SRLPs. They're the ones that have insurance and are sort of maybe awaiting mitigation. The mitigated ones are about a third of the total, and the non-mitigated, uninsured severe repetitive loss properties, the ones that have just dropped out of the program and are lost to follow-up, are actually a higher proportion of the body of SRLPs than the mitigated properties. If you'd like to learn more about severe repetitive loss properties, we published a nifty little data dashboard on our NRDC website a few months ago. You can actually go in and download the data set. There we go. That's where you can download the data set. That's behind these graphs. This is actually a data set that we received from the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and it's never before been made public. But you can go in and download it on our website and use it for your own analyses. I hope you do, and if you do, tell us about it, because I'd love to see what you do with it. And so we're using this information to look at where are these areas that have so many severe repetitive loss properties? Where are there disproportionate numbers of them compared to what we might expect for the underlying flood risk? Who lives in these properties? What are local jurisdictions doing about this risk? What are they not doing about this risk? How can we change federal policy so that it makes it easier to do things about this risk? And so we have a few of these. Oh yeah, this is just a picture of our data dashboard. You can go to the website at the bottom of the screen here and play around with it if you like. Unsurprisingly, you see large proportions of severe repetitive loss properties along the US Gulf Coast, and also the Northeast in the New York, New Jersey area. If you don't want to go in and play with the data, you can also, you don't have to take our word for it. Actually, the week before we published this data dashboard, the Office of Inspector General, who's basically like the oversight office of FEMA in the Department of Homeland Security, published a report saying that they independently looked into the issue of severe repetitive loss properties and found that, quote, FEMA provides neither equitable nor timely relief to the people who live there. Again, not a surprise, but it's interesting to see such strong language coming from another US federal agency saying, look, these are the properties that if you were going to do anything, you should be doing it to help the people who live in these properties, to help the communities that are sustaining this repeated flood damage. And we can't even do that. So what does that say about our overall strategy to reduce disaster risk? And of course, going back to that Venn diagram of hazard and exposure and vulnerability, it shouldn't be a surprise that the burden of this repetitive flooding does not occur equally across the population. Another flood myth, at least here in the US, is that people choose to live in flood zones. And I mean, some do. People like living near the water. It's nice, you know, to live by a body of water in a lot of cases, in a lot of places. And so when we think about flood insurance, we think, well, why is the federal government bailing out millionaires with beach houses, right? But that's such a small percentage of the issue. In the first place, the National Flood Insurance Program's maximum payouts are way less than what most millionaire beach houses cost. So they're probably not even in that insurance pool to begin with, or at least not for the whole value of their home. But on the other hand, when we think about who faces flood risk in the US, flood-prone land is usually less expensive. It's less valued for obvious reasons. And so who lives there? It's people who either they or their predecessors didn't have a choice or were put there on purpose by other institutions and systems. And so, so we see that low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, Black communities in particular, are disproportionately faced with flood risk. And these aren't your communities at the beach with their big houses. A lot of these repetitively flooded properties are Back Bay communities. They're communities that live along the river that flows to the coast, that are faced with this chronic and horrifying repetitive flooding. And the important part, I mentioned this before, the systems and processes that we use to respond to disasters really just act to cement that disproportionate burden. So because one of the major ways that we respond to disasters is by giving money, grants or cash, you know, depending on the situation, or insurance payouts, that's all based on the monetary value of what you owned. It's meant to make you whole financially, which makes sense in a logical way. But at the same time, it's just cementing these massive wealth inequalities across different communities. The paper at the bottom here, I recommend that everyone take a look at it. I think it might even be open access. By Howell and Elliott, describes how after a flood disaster, white families actually tend to gain wealth, whereas Black families lose wealth on average in the US. And so we're looking at a disaster recovery and aid system that is not helping people move towards a better future, but actively entrenching the unequal systems that we have already and making them worse. So as to not completely depress all of us, there are some things that we can do about it. And these are some of the policy options that NRDC is advocating for in our work. Again, mostly at the federal level, but a lot of these can be implemented in different areas of the flood space, not just in the National Flood Insurance Program, but also in the state and local level. The primary thing that we think about is sort of giving communities the tools that they need to make the best choices to adapt to climate change. And a lot of these are very similar to the kinds of improvements that we look at in terms of housing and community development and employment and healthcare and all of the other sort of factors that go into a robust and resilient community. But specifically within the flood insurance program, making it easier to access the funding that you need in order to reduce risk at a property, shifting our the way that we fund hazard mitigation from, oh no, a disaster happened, guess we have to build back better, to actually thinking about risk proactively and taking steps before a disaster hits. In general, building local capacity so that it's not just the wealthy communities that have a big tax base that can afford to take steps to reduce their risk. Supporting community-driven programs where residents, have the agency to decide how they want their community to face the increased risks from climate change. Transparency and disclosure is an interesting component of this, and it's something that surprises a lot of people. So if you, for example, live in the US, you're going to buy a house, chances are no one is responsible for telling you whether or not that house has ever flooded before. In about half of the US states, there's just no requirement for that to happen. And in most of the rest, the laws are pretty inadequate. In New York, for example, which on the face of it has a pretty robust disclosure requirement, the seller can choose to pay $500 and just ignore that disclosure requirement. And you can imagine the number of properties in New York that are subject to flood risk. And if you buy a house, no one's going to tell you whether or not it's flooded before. It's also hard to get information straight from the federal government. I mentioned this data set that we got from FEMA. My colleagues with legal expertise spent a really long time filing petitions and Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits to try and get information like this and other types of data sets that's held very closely by the federal government. You actually can't say now you own your house, that house that you bought perhaps in New York, and no one told you if it was going to flood. And there's the Weather Service says the next hurricane season is going to be a doozy. So you call FEMA, you call the flood insurance program, and you say, hey, should I, has this house ever been insured by the flood insurance program? Has it ever had claims? And they can't tell you that. They can only tell current policyholders. So you're left in the dark often until your home floods, and then you realize that flooding is a reality in your neighborhood. Finally, there's a lot of things that we can do to improve the flood insurance program, like I said before, as a sort of forward-thinking climate strategy. Right now, the flood risks that are used to make development decisions across the 22,000 local jurisdictions that participate in the NFIP, as well as the flood insurance decisions made by the program itself, are based all on backward-looking data. My colleague here at NRDC likes to say that that's like making decisions like you're driving down a highway only looking in the rearview mirror. And that's fine as long as the road ahead of you is perfectly straight and exactly the same as it was before. But of course, in our climate change reality, that's far from the truth. And so there are a lot of improvements that can be made to map future risk in addition to past risk, and incorporate a sort of more nuanced understanding of how climate affects flood risk, and then incorporating that into the decisions that we make as local governments and as residents. So that, oh gosh, I thought I'm going to do this in half an hour, and I think I did. So that's just an overview of some of the things that we think about a lot here at NRDC. If you have particular questions, we can open it up for discussion now. But if you want to contact us at any time, my contact information is here. As Eli pointed out, I am on Twitter. I use it to procrastinate from my actual work. So if you want to hit me up on Twitter, that's a good way to get in contact with me. And if you go to the website here, that's my blog page, you can click through to that dashboard that I showed you and explore the severe repetitive loss property data set on your own.
Thank you so much. We do definitely have time for questions. And if someone would like to pose a question, I will moderate. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, which is the hand icon up the top of your Teams dashboard. And we have a hand raised. Go ahead.
Is that me?
It's you.
Hi.
Yes, we can hear you.
This is Rebecca Elliott. First, let me just say I endorse Anna as a Twitter presence. I use Anna's tweets to procrastinate on my own work. And also just to start by saying that I'm so grateful to the work that you are doing and the work that NRDC has done on flood insurance, especially getting some of this data from FEMA, which doesn't seem like it should be so complicated, but of course has been. And I joined late, so apologies if any of this is asking about stuff that you've already described. But I'm wondering, I'd be curious to hear about your thoughts, or if NRDC has considered in thinking about kind of proposals to the NFIP. When I first started looking at flood insurance many years ago, there was some conversation about maybe shifting to community policies. So rather than the product being an insurance policy that individual householders own, that actually the community would buy the policy, and then the community could make decisions about not rating the risk, but what to charge, to account for the fact that, you know, the financial pressure of paying for flood insurance feels differently depending on the kinds of means that you have and the kind of risk that you have. So yeah, I mean, I'd just be kind of curious to hear, you know, if you've personally thought about that at all, or if NRDC has thought about that as another potential reform to the program.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's not something that I think about a lot in my work. However, that is something that has come up in the last couple of legislative proposals for the National Flood Insurance Program. So in case, you know, no one here is following this as closely as I am, which I really hope that you're not. The National Flood Insurance Program actually expired. Its statutory authority expired going on 4 years ago at this point, sometime in 2017. And it's actually never been reauthorized. It's supposed to be reauthorized periodically, like many US federal programs are. And Congress has instead just been giving it short-term, sort of like kick the can reauthorization since then. And so there's been a couple of times in that interim period where, in particular, the House of Representatives has proposed legislation that would reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program for real, and also make a bunch of reforms to it. And so NRDC has been closely involved in that process, advocating for, you know, include the things that we think are good and don't include the things that we think are bad, right? Like all advocates. And so anyway, so while we haven't worked specifically on that proposal, it's something that was in the last round of the last bill, was in there as a pilot program. And so I think from a policy perspective, doing it as a pilot program is smart, because that's how you're going to get the ability to do it at all, is to get Congress to agree to sign on for a pilot. And so we hope and assume that the next Congress will be working from a similar starting point as that bill from the last Congress. And so we might see that community-based flood insurance pop up again.
Kevin, you're up.
Can you hear and see me?
Yes, hi.
Yes, so yeah, thanks, Rebecca, for that question. And kind of to build off of that a little bit, I guess another question, I mean, has there been any discussion, kind of even going a little more broadly than that? This actually comes from one of my collaborators, Sarah Prowley, at Syracuse University, who's also kind of working on some of these questions. And she's asked me, and Anna, you might have a better insight on this, whether there's been any talk of kind of even going broader to something like kind of combining different environmental hazards into a big insurance pool, so fire and flood, and is there any sort of discussion going on about that? Is that actually realistic, or is that something that NRDC is interested in? Since I know you've talked about how you have different people in NRDC working about the dry versus the wet side of climate change per se, and things like that. So is there any discussion at NRDC about something like that, and or does that not have any real political traction at the moment, or what does that look like on your side?
Yeah, it's not something that we, that comes up in our conversations with lawmakers. But obviously it's something that a lot of scholars and practitioners are talking about, this sort of idea of all hazards insurance. And I think just from a practical perspective, as we see the fire insurance issues playing out in California, where we have large insurers battling the state government because they don't want to cover this risk. That's very similar to how we ended up with the National Flood Insurance Program, with private insurers saying, no, we're out, we don't want to cover this, and then the government stepping in. And I can't even speculate on like how that will play out, but I think that there's going to be a reckoning in terms of hazard insurance across all hazards. And I mean, we do see for, say, wind hazard, in particular associated with tropical storms. So there are a few states that have their own like wind pool as sort of an insurer of last resort for homeowners who can't get coverage because their risk is so high. They can go into this state pool. And so there's sort of like bits of this coming in around the edges. But yeah, I don't know where that's heading, but I think it'll be really interesting to watch.
Do we have any other questions for our speaker? Now's your chance. Well, I guess I have something I've been wondering about, and I just the FEMA report where they sort of raise a hand and they're it's the mea culpa FEMA report that came around, that you posted there among the slides was interesting to see, because it's I guess, what was your sense of, or loaded in that document or included in that document, was there a sense of like, well, we're not covering it to the standard required, so was there a sense of who should be instead? Like, was there a shifting? Was it like, what was the purpose of that document? Was it to sort of direct it somewhere else? Was it I've been wondering a lot about the push-pull of sort of the nationalized versus the privatized systems for these sorts of, who is on the hook, or do you turn it into a pooled risk market, or like what's the alternative system that's sort of buried in a document like that?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so that report comes from the Office of Inspector General within the sort of umbrella agency. So this is it's nested within the same federal agency, but it acts as almost as an independent watchdog for the rest of the agency, saying, hey, you did well at this, you did badly at this. And there's also, so it's coming from a perspective of almost like internal auditing, saying, hey, this is our mission and we're not fulfilling it. And we need to do better. And there are recommendations in there about how the agency could take action itself to do better. And then there are also a series of reports, a lot actually, from the entity that functions in that capacity in the overall U.S. federal government, the Government Accountability Office, who very frequently puts out reports saying things like, FEMA needs better data transparency and accountability for its flood insurance. I'm making that up, but it's probably like all of those words appear in the titles of these reports. And it's sad, but it's funny to read, because there are lines in these GAO reports that say, we have been saying this since 1983. Like, as we have written in the previous 27 reports, the way that we the government structured the National Flood Insurance Program isn't working. And a lot of that, I think, is this tension between, like, it is an insurance provider. It's supposed to be operating like a business. And so the structures that sort of surround it are trying to keep it solvent, which as an insurer of last resort, essentially, it can't do that, especially in a world where risk is increasing and we keep building expensive things in harm's way. So risk is not just increasing because of the hazard itself, but also because of the exposure. And in that sort of situation, there's no way that an insurance program can stay afloat. And so, of course, then we have situations where Congress comes in and bails out the debt of the National Flood Insurance Program, which it's done a couple of times. But then there's that tension of, well, how do we price risk as an insurance program in a way that tries to keep the program afloat, but also is affordable to the people who really need it, because we want people to have some sort of insurance, but also at the same time that communicates risk effectively, which is a whole nother part, of course, of the flood insurance program that they're sort of trying to deal with right now, but that the way that they price their policies doesn't match up to your actual risk. And so there's just lots of issues with there, and they're sort of continuously pointed out by these different agency and congressional watchdogs. But it's almost like a little sort of cycle of kick the can in and of itself. It's like, oh, Congress needs to take action. Well, FEMA's not interpreting this properly. Like, oh, actually, it's the states, and so on and so forth.
Rebecca, back to you. Sorry, was that garbled? There we go. Rebecca, back to you is what I meant to say.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Oh, hi, sorry. Still, I'm not totally proficient in Teams.
Or any of us, even at this point.
I know. Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, and NRDC seems in many ways to be the kind of the environmental organization that's paying the closest attention to flood insurance at the moment, and also in particular some of the issues around its relationship to inequality and as it exists economically, but also as it relates to vulnerability to natural hazards. So I'd just be curious to kind of hear your characterization of sort of the broader space of environmental organizations and kind of how they're situated relative to some of these issues. Are there people who are, or organizations that are like kind of particularly aligned with you? Are there environmentalists that perhaps have very different ideas about what the future of the NFIP might involve?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And I've only worked at NRDC for about 2 years. So this was a surprise to me when I came in and realized that this is something that environmental organizations work on. We do work with a coalition of environmental organizations that we're often very aligned on these sort of very specific policy fixes to the NFIP. And so organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Union of Concerned Scientists, we work very closely with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, which is not an advocacy organization, but a professional organization. But obviously, they are the professional organization who deals with flood insurance and floodplain management. And they do actually a lot of advocacy out of the sort of advocacy arm of their institution. I think, and there are also a lot of environmental orgs that are coming at this from the sort of conservation and preservation of ecosystems space, because that's, one of our best weapons in, reducing flood risk, is to let the floodplain be a floodplain, let wetlands be wetlands, let mangroves be mangroves, right? And so there's an intersection with, say, a city is doing a hazard mitigation program where they're going to buy out some repeatedly flooded properties, and then, what if a conservation org came in and managed those properties, and, restored the wetlands, and now we're being more effective at, preventing flooding in the rest of the neighborhood. There's an organization based in Virginia called Wetlands Watch that's doing a lot of work in that space. They have some really innovative ideas about how to make buyout programs work better, sort of outside of the current system where they don't work very well for most people. I think in general, it's been interesting to watch environmental organizations in general start to think more deeply about adaptation, just sort of broadly. I think there was a period of time where environmental organizations, just sort of as a sector, were saying, if we think about adaptation, it means we gave up. And we need to reduce those emissions so that we never have to think about adaptation. And to me, that is such a privileged point of view, because sure, we can sit in our, ivory tower or whatever the equivalent is for a nonprofit organization and say, oh, we're going to be protecting our grandchildren by reducing emissions. Well, people's grandchildren are already suffering from climate change. And what does it mean if you're only focusing on these hypothetical future, people, and not on the people in our communities who are being affected by climate change right now? And I think that that's been a very positive move, and something that NRDC, I think, has done very intentionally, is to think more about climate adaptation as a necessary part of thinking about climate change. And then along those lines, also thinking about other aspects of sort of our broader society that impact adaptive capacity. And so we have folks who work on issues related to affordable housing and health and labor, because these all intersect, obviously, with our environment, even though they're a little bit outside what we might think of as like the traditional space of an environmental nonprofit.
Well, with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And this has been terrific. And I'm really glad to add your talk to the growing list. And it was great to talk with you for the podcast as well. And I'm just really excited that that these conversations are happening. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. It's always great to chat with you. Plus, we got the bonus of talking to Rebecca and Devin. So
right,
great,
right?
A little fun club over here.
So many thanks, and thanks for coming to support the speaker, everybody. And we'll catch you very soon. Good luck in the next few days, and we wish you well, and get some sleep with your elderly housemate there.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you.